Hi, I'm John. I'm an emergency physician, and I'm here to talk about the impact of the loss of a patient on me as a doctor.
Hi, I'm Catherine, and I'm here to share my story following the loss of my father to a misdiagnosed aortic dissection, and how over the years I've turned my pain into a passion.
Welcome to The Silent Why, a podcast on a mission to explore 101 different types of permanent loss and to hear from those who have experienced each one. I'm Claire.
I'm Chris, and in this episode we're doing something a bit different. We're exploring two sides of one story of loss. When someone dies after emergency surgery to save their life, what's it like for the family trying to get there? But also, what's it like for those responsible in the emergency room, or A&E, or emergency department, depending on where you are in the world?
70 adults of all ages every week in the UK and Ireland suffer an aortic dissection, which is when the aorta, a major artery in the body that carries blood from the heart, starts to tear, interrupting blood supply to vital organs. The devastating news about this condition is that around only half of these people survive.
Tim Fleming was sadly one of those who didn't. He died in February 2015 in a hospital in Dublin. One of our guests in this episode is his daughter, Catherine Fowler, who was en route with family to fly over from England to be with him. But sadly, Tim died before they reached the hospital.
It was just very, very difficult to hear and didn't feel real. Just trying to do simple things like getting through the departures. I couldn't get anything to work. I just lost all ability to physically function and to think properly. And my mum couldn't really take in the news at all. I mean, her shock I could recognise was beyond mine.
We're also joined by John Cronin, a consultant in emergency medicine who was on duty in the ER that day when Tim was admitted and aware of colleagues' attempts to try and diagnose his condition.
But our two guests didn't actually meet in the hospital that day. It was through Tim's death and their search for answers as to why it happened that they finally met in a way neither would have expected.
I think people do find it surprising. We have got ourselves into a space where we can, respect each other's loss and grief and come together and try and make something really, really positive.
And what they've been working on since is something we should all be thankful for, because it has massively changed the approach to diagnosing aortic dissection, a condition where a staggering 33% of cases are misdiagnosed.
It's changed the approach of every department in Ireland and probably across the UK. You'll struggle to meet any doctor in an emergency department or in the relevant specialties who wouldn't be aware of it and who hasn't been impacted by it.
In this episode, Catherine and John share their experiences of the day of Tim's death, the challenges on both of their sides when it comes to a potentially avoidable death, but also how it's been a catalyst to help educate others.
It's a valuable insight into symptoms we should all be aware of when it comes to aortic dissection, and how the power of people coming together to educate can literally save the lives of others.
We kicked off this conversation by asking Catherine and John to introduce themselves.
My name's Catherine Fowler. I am a mother of two beautiful children. I'm also wife to Keith. I work in the energy industry full-time, leading a team of fantastic people, and also really enjoy being involved in leadership development as well. So that's kind of like my day-to-day job. In my spare time, which I don't really have much of spare time anymore, I volunteer for NHS England as a public patient voice. And I support their cardiac clinical reference group and also their clinical policy group. And in 2020, I was a co-founder of the first charity that focuses on aortic dissection, so the Aortic Dissection Charitable Trust. And in the summer of 2022, I was really proud to receive an honour in Westminster for my voluntary work and services to healthcare in Great Britain. So kids, parents, work, voluntary life is very full and very busy.
John Cronin is my name. I'm a consultant in emergency medicine in Dublin. I'm based at St. Vincent's University Hospital. And I trained partly in Australia and partly here in Ireland on our national training programme. And part of towards the last year of my training programme, I was in Tala University Hospital where my paths crossed with Catherine's. My working week varies from day to day. I tend to do about 3 days of clinical work on the floor, busy seeing patients in the emergency department, and then 1 or 2 days where I do other non-clinical stuff. I've interest in research and in education through simulation. So I spend a lot of time doing that. I also, as an emergency physician, because we see a lot of different things, you end up developing too many other areas of interest. So I have an interest in road safety, and I kind of sit on the board of our Road Safety Authority, which is our national organisation looking at road safety. And I've interest in other clinical areas, very much in aortic dissection as well. And yeah, I'm married to Eilish, who's also a doctor, and we have 3 girls. So life's very busy in that.
Just as a physician, what does that practically look like? Is that more about seeing patients face-to-face, administering care, treatment, drugs? What sort of doctoring do you do?
I'm an emergency physician, so if you take any average class of medical students who become doctors, probably about 60 to 70% of them will become GPs. And then people tend to specialise in other areas. Some people leave medicine, do other things, business or whatever. But people tend to specialise in other areas. So surgery is one, then there's a lot of different areas of surgery, whether there's vascular or general surgery or cardiothoracics. Then you've a lot of people who become physicians, and you can specialise in anything from renal to liver to respiratory, whatever. What I specialise is in emergency medicine. So we have a training program, which is quite a long training program, to become a qualified emergency physician, which is what I am. And then you become a consultant in emergency medicine. So basically I work in an emergency department. So our role, like emergency departments are very busy places. So in our emergency department, it's a busy urban/suburban university teaching hospital. So we'll see about 200 patients a day. And that's pretty consistent, even though emergency work is unscheduled, it's fairly predictable, the numbers that come through. So we see about 200 patients a day. So you have to kind of sort them. So we'll, as the consultant, as the kind of person often in charge, you will have a team of doctors of various grades under you. Some who are at a senior level and are able to work independently, many are at a junior level, who will need to consult with you about their patients. And then I'll see patients myself. So as a consultant in the emergency department, I have some days where I'm on the floor seeing patients, and I have other days where I'm the consultant in charge. The one thing I can maybe compare it to is like being an air traffic controller at an airport. You have 200 flights going in and out a day, and you can't get out and fly all those planes or land all those planes. But you need someone who's has an eye over the flow. Flow is a big thing when we talk about emergency departments, because 200 patients are coming in tomorrow, guaranteed. Might be 180, might be 220, but they will come tomorrow. So today's patients have to be sorted and have to be moved on, have to be either discharged or forwarded to the correct care, or cured, or told there's nothing wrong with you, go home, or whatever it is. So yeah, that's roughly the size of it. So some of it is kind of flow and that sort of management. Then when you're physically seeing patients, you can be seeing anything from someone who stubbed their toe to somebody who has a kind of massively complex trauma, and you're doing very complex procedures on them, and everything in between.
Catherine, let's focus a bit on the event that ultimately led to you and John coming into contact. Take us back to what happened with your dad.
My dad, Tim Fleming, he was a lovely man. He was 69 years young. He was a husband, a father, he was a grandfather, hugely engaged, very active in life. Grew up in Ireland. He moved to London in the 60s, where he met my mum. An Irish couple met in London and settled in London. So Dad was living in London, but he was on a short trip to Dublin. So it was a 3-day trip. It was on the morning that he was due to fly home. I had received a call from a doctor from Dublin's largest A&E department. It was 6 a.m. in the morning, so it was quite an unusual time to receive a call as well. And it was explained to me that my dad was very unwell, that he was suffering from either indigestion or something that was called an aortic dissection. So I had never really heard of that condition before, and that made me uncomfortable in itself. I had lots and lots of questions, and the doctor explained to me the role of the aorta in the body, has a very important role. It brings blood around to all of the major organs, and that when a dissection happens, it's when there's a tear in the aorta. And that's kind of as far as the description went at that point. And I had lots of questions around, I suppose, the seriousness of the condition. So what kind of danger might Dad be in? Is it something that could be treated? The information at that point was pretty light. It was explained that there was more investigations that were to take place, and that He'd call me back in a few hours. So he explained they needed to do a CT scan. I asked, could I talk to my dad? And sadly, that was declined. The doctor explained that Dad had been administered with a lot of morphine, and so he may not either be able to understand what I was saying or wouldn't be able to communicate back to me. And I think at that point, for me, I knew it was something very, very serious. And I remember saying, I don't think it is indigestion that my dad has. I think it must be that other thing, that aortic thing that you mentioned. But he reassured me that they needed to go off and do their investigations. He was very clear in not upsetting my mother, not putting the family into any kind of distress. So he would call back in a few hours. I advised I was going to book a flight to Dublin. Given that Dad was due to come back that evening, I thought if it's something like indigestion, I could be sitting on the plane, taken back home to London. If it's something more serious, then absolutely a family member should be with Dad. So kind of went against his advice. He was saying there was no need at that stage. And conversation was kind of left there. I phoned around the family and clearly everyone was quite shocked. Dad was a very, very healthy man. And then it was a few hours later, I received another call, probably the same doctor. And it was clear that he was really distressed. And he said, things are looking pretty serious. Your dad has had an aortic dissection, which has ruptured, but we've managed to resuscitate him. He needs to be taken to another hospital and he requires surgery. Bring your mother to Dublin as soon as possible. You're probably likely to be staying in Dublin for a while. Surgery like this takes a long time to recover. So kind of, pack your bags and make your way over. I had received a call in between those two calls from somebody who had been travelling with my dad as well. And they had explained that Dad had in fact been taken into A&E the previous day. So he had been discharged at 2 a.m. in the morning with a diagnosis of indigestion. And I think the test on whether he should go home was whether he could tolerate tea and toast, which he did. And he went back to his hotel, but clearly things didn't settle and he came back to the hospital. And that's when we got the call at 6 to say that things clearly need to be investigated further. So immediately I was kind of, I suppose more than upset. I hadn't heard this information up front in that Dad had had a previous admission, and I had lots of questions about how had Dad been discharged, what were the tests that were done at the point of discharge. So I was really highly emotional, very, very worried. What are his chances? And the response was, your dad's a really sick man. You need to get to Dublin as soon as possible. You need to bring your mother with you. Here's the switchboard number of the hospital that your father's going to. And that was a bit of a trigger for me. I was thinking we're just going to get lost in the system. How am I going to stay connected? I'm going to be on a flight. So it was very, very distressing. But nonetheless, phoned around my family, spoke to my brother and asked if he bring him on to the airport that would meet at Gatwick. And we needed to make our way to Dublin because things were looking pretty serious. No one in the family knew what an aortic dissection was. I met my brother and my mum at the airport and we were sitting having a coffee before we entered into the departures lounge, just trying to get our head around what was going on. So I was kind of sitting quite calmly and just trying to explain to my brother and equally to my mum that things were pretty serious, that it was a big operation. I remember my brother, he had it in his head, and I suppose I kind of had in my head, there's no way this is Dad's moment to die. He was so healthy, so fit. And as we were having this discussion, my mobile rang and it was an Irish number. And for me, I kind of thought there's only one place that can be calling right now, but it's really the wrong time for the call. We hadn't arrived in Dublin. The surgery wouldn't have, been completed. I knew it was too soon to receive any kind of call. So kind of stepped away. And it was a call from somebody who travelled with my father and told me that my dad didn't make it and my dad had died, which was, just a real, I don't know, shock isn't the word. It was just real disbelief. It was like an out-of-body experience. And I was kind of about to end the call and is there anybody there from the hospital who I can just talk to try and understand like what's actually happened? And there was. So a lady came to the phone and in her words, she said, your dad died on the table. You need to get to Dublin as soon as possible. you need to come to Ireland and identify his body. So we were kind of, from her perspective, kicking into a bit of a process, and it was just very, very difficult to hear and didn't feel real. It was probably the hardest conversation I ever had to have with my mum and my brother, and sharing the news with my siblings as well. And yeah, just trying to take that journey, I'm just trying to do simple things like getting through the departures. I couldn't get anything to work. I just lost all ability to physically function and to think properly. And my mum couldn't really take in the news at all. Like, it just was not making any sense to her. It was just, her shock I could recognize was beyond mine. Her ability to function was really lost, and straight away kind of confused as to what we were doing and why we were going to Dublin. But we made our way, and we were met at the airport by some family members. So we've got lots of relations in Ireland, and a couple of the gentlemen who had been travelling out with Dad, and so Dad's belongings were being handed over. I had Dad's wedding ring, and I was also given a dictaphone. Dad was in a meeting when he became unwell, so everything that kind of unfolded there had been recorded. And the gentleman was saying, it's very important, hold on to this. So we travelled on to the hospital to see Dad, and everything felt like it was pretty unreal. When we arrived at the hospital, they had an outbreak of flu. So this was way before COVID times. This was February 2015. And so the hospital was on a lockdown. And there was, all of the high vis, everything that we were very used to seeing in COVID. But for me, it was like something out of a movie. Very, very strange. But there was a nurse waiting in the foyer in the lobby, and she was expecting us. So she kind of, pulled us through. But before we walked into the room, I kind of held the nurse's hand, and I said, just when we walk around this door, is Dad just going to be there? What are we going to see? Does Dad look like he's sleeping? Like, what should we be getting ready to expect? She said, in all my years of nursing, she said, I've never seen a corpse like this. And I immediately stopped her before she went any further, and just said, this is my mum's husband of over 40 years. It's my dad. He's a person. It's not a corpse. And just every moment made everything so much harder. There wasn't kind of any like empathy coming from the team who were, I suppose, guiding us through that process. And that was really hard. I remember talking to Mum, just saying, look, you don't need to do this. I can go in and formally identify Dad, and maybe it's better for you to remember, Dad in life rather than Dad in death. And Mum's mothering instinct really kicked in then. She was like, well, maybe that's something that you shouldn't be exposed to. She said, I'm happy to do that. And I said, okay, well, let's do it together then, and we'll support each other. And so we went through, and it was really hard. Dad was still warm, wanted to touch him, and I could still smell Dad in his hair. But he was very much, he had all of the medical kind of equipment still there. It couldn't be removed because of the suddenness of his death. It all needed to be investigated with regards to a post-mortem. So he kind of remained untouched from the surgery. And we were waiting for a while for the Garda, which is the police, to come and do the formality of identifying Dad. So we spent a lot of time, which in a strange way, I don't know whether it was comforting or not, but it made everything, of course, very real. I think up until that point, all those hours, everything just felt so surreal. And so not how you would imagine getting the news of losing a loved one, someone being so well and having that news, and then all of the events of that day just were never how I would imagined an experience of a loss. So having that time with Dad, and I suppose allowing that reality to kind of kick in, I don't know whether it helped a bit, but I felt like I needed to be there. I didn't feel like I wanted to leave or to be anywhere else. Dad's surgeon came in, explained a little about the condition. I know he was really trying to reassure me, and it's always stuck with me. He was saying, at some point in time, Catherine, he said, you will take comfort that your dad passed away like this, because the condition that he arrived to surgery was not the best, which meant that his outcome, had he survived, probably wouldn't have looked so good. He was certain that Dad would have had suffered a stroke, and he thought there was a very high chance that Dad would have been left paraplegic, which of course I don't think that Dad would have enjoyed or coped well with a life like that after that illness. But it did trigger a series of questions for me immediately around the condition that Dad arrived in to surgery, because I was made aware earlier that morning that Dad was in the day before, that he had been discharged, he'd come back. And so a lot of time was lost. I just wanted to understand a bit more about the condition, in that if Dad had arrived sooner, and if the diagnosis had been made and transfer had been made and he'd had a perfect pathway, what would have happened then? Would we be having this conversation? I explained to him, I was like, my dad's such a fit and healthy man, and if you were in my shoes, you'd be asking questions too. All I'm trying to do is to get information and just understand how this has happened, and could things have been different. And then later that night, the Garda came along and we went through the process of formal identification, and he explained that there would be an inquest just to do with the timing of Dad's passing, that he was in hospital for such a short period of time, that the coroner would want to understand what had happened. And for me, I thought, well, at least there is a place for, the questions to be answered, and maybe now isn't the right time to try and understand all of that. I found it very hard to leave Dad that night. And in fact, it was probably the early hours of the morning. And we went and stayed with my cousin. Sadly for Mum, we found out, months down the line, it triggered an accelerated onset for Alzheimer's, which Mum still lives with today. So the whole experience was just hugely shocking and catastrophic for Mum. She's my superhero, really. She's so strong with her journey and what she's lived with since then. So yeah, it was a very, very difficult time. We had lots of questions for the emergency department, and my sister met with the team. They had a long meeting, and it was explained that aortic dissection was a hopeless condition, was really the way that they explained it to us, in that people just don't get diagnosed, and if you get diagnosed, you don't have great outcomes, and really you should see it along the lines that it was really your dad's fate. And it was hard to hear, and we felt there was a lot of unanswered questions in those very, very early days. The day after Dad's funeral, Dad's sister suffered an aortic dissection. So we failed to tell the emergency team what had just happened to her brother and that he had lost his life. But fair play to them, they suspected that's what was happening. And she had a CT scan and her dissection was diagnosed, and she had her emergency surgery, which saved her life. But, her life was never the same again. And for me, that was a real moment of awareness, I suppose, in that aortic dissection cannot be a hopeless condition. How did this happen? So really opened a lot more questions for us, and we understood that aortic dissection is a condition that can be detected, it can be treated, and that people can survive it. And for me, that, and my family, that really changed everything. My dad was always a campaigner in his life, and he had been sharing with my older sister those change.org campaigns. And so we decided that would be, I suppose, a bit of a vehicle to share what had happened and to call for change. We knew that it was a condition that could be detected and treated. And we started a petition that we were hoping would go viral, and we would be able to make a case for change to the Secretary of State for Health in the UK and equally for the HSE in Ireland. It didn't go viral. I mean, the campaign is still live now, and it has 10,000 signatures, people who are living with a condition and families like ours who have lost a loved one. And I suppose that was our first kind of step into trying to amplify the voice of others. And I suppose I don't know how active the decision was at that point, but really trying to harness pain and grief and put it in a place into something that could be more positive, and to try and drive change.
John, listening to all of that, because in your work, you've mentioned numbers of how many people you see through the emergency department. You know, for many years, you'll have dealt with many individuals without knowing all of the stories, the family setups, all the background, the before, the during, the after. What's it like listening to Catherine talk and just getting all of that colour, all of that context?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite emotional, and hearing that personal side of it, yeah, definitely home. And I've heard Catherine talk before, been at a few conferences, so I've heard the story, and maybe you've added more personal detail there. I think, as I said, when you're working in an emergency department and you've a couple of hundred patients coming in a day, particularly if you're in charge, you need that flow. You need everyone to go through it, to go to the appropriate places, and your mind is very much on safety and making sure you're not missing things. And sometimes you can lose that personal touch when when you have the bird's eye view like that. Now, when you're working with shift and you're seeing individual patients, you always try to make that kind of personal bond with them. But if I had a clinical shift the last 2 days, I was working on the floor yesterday and the day before. So if you asked me to describe each patient and where they're from that I saw, or even to recall all of them, I'd struggle. But if I asked you, when were you last in an emergency department, you'd remember. I remember when I was in an emergency department when I was 10 or whatever. So when you go to an emergency department as a patient, it's often a bit of an index event in your life. Even if you just sprained an ankle, you always remember it. And you'll probably remember the doctor and say passion history, like, oh, that was the guy or girl I saw in the hospital. But if someone who I saw yesterday could walk past me and I wouldn't remember them. So when you're kind of dealing with that volume, when you're doing day by day, it just becomes part of your job. But then, there are one or two patients that you see during your career or during every maybe 6 months or every year that really kind of stay with you. And certainly Catherine's story and Tim's story is one that definitely stayed with me.
Tell us what it was like on the other side of that story then, because obviously you're on the other side. Catherine's looking for questions. You probably know some of the answers. What was your experience of that day and that shift?
So, I was a senior. I was an SBR, so a specialist registrar. So I was kind of on maybe the final furlong of my training to becoming fully qualified emergency physician. I'd take up a consultant post later that year in a different hospital, but I was working in that hospital in the final year of my training. So I'd say it was kind of February 2015. I also had my kind of final exams around that time of year. So it was a very kind of busy time for me. And it was a busy hospital and a very busy department. That particular day, I was working an evening shift. So we tend to have day, evening, and night shifts. I was working an evening shift, so it was kind of 4 p.m. till midnight. And when you work 4 to midnight, you already got out at midnight. You'd be 1 or 2 in the morning. You'd be kind of getting home and then trying to relax and trying at some stage to get some sleep and get ready for the next day. And the evening shifts often tended to be the most busy time because people presenting all during the day who were in the department getting investigated, getting treatment, and then there's kind of a busy time during the evening when patients tend to come in. So you have a big volume of people coming through. Also, that particular department and many emergency departments were very overcrowded. So all your bays to see patients would be full, and there are patients out in the corridors. Some patients who were waiting for a bed for hours or sometimes even days were there in the corridor. So it very much cramps your working conditions. We were also, I think, short-staffed, but when I say that, we were chronically short-staffed. So there was the registrar on the 4 to midnight shift. There would always be 2 registrars. There was another registrar on the 4 to midnight shift. The other registrar was less experienced. To say we were short-staffed, so he was a locum, so maybe wasn't as familiar with the place. Wasn't as far along in his training as I was, so definitely I was the more senior person. But nevertheless, he was a registrar. But sometimes I need to, as well as keeping an eye on the juniors and seeing my own patients and sorting out my own patients, I'd be keeping an eye on the juniors and aware that maybe the other person who I was on with maybe wouldn't be as quick or experienced or as capable as me. So I guess when I put it that, it is a fairly stressed working environment, but it's kind of chronically like that. So you kind of get used to that kind of chronic stress and shortage of space and of resources. And remember working that particular evening in any emergency department. You have a resuscitation area where the sickest patients go, and in that department there were 6 resus bays. So those are where the sickest patients would be. Then you do your majors cubicles and the minors cubicles where the other patients would be. But the resuscitation bays was where the sickest ones would be. And I remember 5 of the 6 resuscitation bays were under me. So I was there are different stages of being sorted out. Either you're being treated, being referred on to other teams and that sort of stuff. And I was also trying to keep an eye on the general flow of the department. I was aware that there was a gentleman there with chest pain who one of my other colleagues was on the J shift who had seen initially, and had handed over to my colleague. Often when you're finishing your shift, you'd be nice if all your patients are sorted, but often as when you're in an emergency department and you're waiting on blood tests or x-rays or whatever, or treatment, there comes a time when you need to hand it over to a colleague in the emergency department or refer the patient on to a specialist team or whatever. So, Tim was being seen by a colleague who then handed his care over with a plan to the other registrar who was on the kind of 4 to midnight shift. So I was aware, certainly in hindsight after everything that happened, I remember being aware that patient was there. So I was quite busy. And when you get to the last hour of your shift, you start realizing, okay, I need to start wrapping things up here. I have a number of patients on the go. I need to sort these patients out. I need to make sure when I hand over to the people coming on nights that I'm handing over something reasonable and that I've either discharged my patients or I have a plan for all of them, sort of thing. So I was doing all that. And I remember actually there was one particular young patient who was in who had whose kind of family had a number of questions about their care, and they were well enough to go home, and family were concerned, and I was trying to deal with that. That was a bit of a kind of stressful thing. That was almost like the big ticket item on my head that evening, and need to sort out this young person and speak to their family and get everybody on the same page and get them discharged rather than handing them over needlessly to wait all night for nothing. And so that was, I specifically remember that being a thing I had to sort out, as well as the other sick patients in resus. And then at one stage, it must have been the last hour of my shift, I remember walking past, and this gentleman, Tim, as it turned out, was not looking right and was having quite bad pain at that stage, having been fine for a period earlier. And that's the nature of aortic dissection. It can cause absolutely severe pain, the worst pain ever. But as the tear stops tearing, patient gets better, can be sitting up reading the paper. If it starts tearing again, the severe pain comes back, and that's actually a classic sign that you can get with the aortic dissection. And I was also aware, and I talked about flow in emergency departments, because there are always more patients coming through. You need a plan, and you can't just leave someone wallowing in an emergency department. You need a plan. They're either well enough to go home, or they need other further specialist care. And I was aware that this patient had already been handed over from the doctor, so we need to kind of come up with a plan. So I was kind of almost keen not to get involved or to not be picking up more patients, because when you come towards the end of your shift, you start picking up more patients, you're not going to get them sorted out. You have to hand them over to someone else. But nevertheless, if there's a time critical emergency, you're there, you need to help. I remember walking past and asking my colleague, I was like, what's the plan? It was clear that there wasn't a very clear working diagnosis. When you see someone, you need to come up with what we call a differential diagnosis. This could be one of these 3 things, one of this, or this, or maybe it's just this, or maybe it could be one of 5 things, and we need to do all these investigations to figure it out. So you need to come up with your differential diagnosis, and then based on that, you come up with a plan as to what you're going to do. Again, it is easier seeing this in hindsight, but at the time we weren't sure what's going on. I knew we needed a plan, and I remember part of me didn't want to be getting involved because I had my own plate spinning, but I was like, look, there's clearly no plan here. I need to stick my head in. And so I did, and I remember speaking with him for a period of time, just going over the history and stuff and having a look at the various things. I think the blood tests and the x-rays, and there wasn't too much to find on examination, and there wasn't too much to find on the blood test or the x-ray, which again is typical of aortic dissection. But I knew there was something kind of going on. I thought of a few things, one of which was in the aortic dissection, could it be this? But then I thought actually it's more likely to be something else. They call it ischemic gut, which has some crossover. Again, you're losing blood supply to the gut, just of where his pain was at that stage, which was now in his tummy. when he had come in first, when my colleague had seen it, was in his chest. Again, that's a classic thing with dissection. It can start in the chest and travel down. I mean, I was thinking, given the severity, there must be a problem with the blood supply to the gut here. We need surgical specialists to come and see this man and organise scans. At the time in that hospital, it was slightly difficult for us in emergency to get specialist scans or CTs, stuff beyond x-rays. Our colleagues were quite keen that it was a specialist who ordered them. I think they were maybe of the impression that, if we were ordering them, that we'd be ordering them on every single patient. I guess that was kind of the culture, in the place, which maybe kind of rubbed off on our decisions. Anyway, I said to my colleague, look, you need to get a surgeon down here to see this person. This demands what needs to happen. We give him strong painkillers because surgeon down here, he probably needs some imaging and make that happen, sort of thing. So I go back, fixing around my other bits and pieces. I was talking to another family, etc. It came towards the end of my shift again. It was well after midnight at this stage, and I spoke to the guy who was on nights, and I told him about my patients who I needed to hand over. But kind of told the nurse in charge, and my sense of the guy was on nights. I said, "By the another chap over there, my colleague is referring to surgeons. They'll probably need to come down and see him. Might need a scan." Done. And so I'm leaving. I do actually remember leaving that night and thinking, God, I'm good at this. They're lucky I'm here sorting everything out, and not quite that. I'm not an arrogant person, far from when I'm on the other end of the scale, but I just remember thinking, sorted this good, walk out of the place. And my colleague would have been on the English shift. I'd asked him, in the time since I was talking to him, maybe 10 minutes or half an hour earlier, I said, did you get hold of surgeons? He was like, yeah. I said, they're going to see it. He's like, yeah. So I was like, great, we have a plan for everybody. I'm away. And so, yeah, that kind of describes the end of an average shift, really. The next morning we had a teaching session, and we were kind of sitting around talking, the teaching session where the kind of registrars and consultants and the different doctors, we all kind of get together, and usually a couple of people are giving a presentation on the topic of the week or whatever. And before, we're kind of sitting around there talking. A few of them were talking about a patient who had come in during the night who had to be transferred out all of a sudden. And I wasn't really paying too much attention. People are always talking about whatever interesting case had been in the previous day or the previous week or whatever. And they're talking away about it. And the more I was trying to think, hang on a sec, sounds like the man I swung by. How come? And they're saying, oh, he came in during the night. I was like, no, he was in during the day yesterday. I was like, it just wasn't making sense what they're saying. I was like, maybe it's somebody else. And the more they talked about it, I was like, no, hang on a sec. And so I started asking questions, and it turns out someone did come to see him at a later stage, probably during another of those phases where the pain had eased and gone away, and had sent him home with, in hindsight, a proper diagnosis. And then, he came back in during the night, and was obviously, things had progressed, and was obviously far more unwell. And then obviously when he came back in during the night, there was obviously another episode of care, and he has been seen by different doctors and getting the scan and then needing to be transferred out. Obviously I was aware during all that part of his care, but I just remember being, I was like, how did he get, I did remember thinking, how did he get sent home? Like, I just remember thinking that, and so I happened to say to my boss, I was like, just so you know, I did swing by him. No, he wasn't my patient. He wasn't on my list of patients. My name wasn't actually against him. We have IT systems in the department, so if you actually go in, I don't remember watching ER before. There was a big whiteboard. Oh, patients, we have progressed to more IT systems, so your name would be against a patient, and your notes would be written in there or whatever. But my name wasn't against him because I kind of swung by to give kind of senior opinion, if you like. And I said to my boss, I was like, I'm sorry, I don't feel quite right with that. And she said, look, shoot me an email. She was kind of going onto the floor, shoot me an email, let me know what happened, sort of thing. So I did that. And at that stage, that was kind of it from that point of view. I went back to my other colleague who had been on. I said, did you get surgeons come down? He said, he did. In hindsight, it was a more junior surgeon that he'd called. So, and then the nurses were very upset who had been on. They were kind of very upset and kind of angry about it. But really, that was kind of it at that stage. And for us as healthcare providers, that's not a nice way to end, because there's a process that's going to happen now. There's going to be questions asked. There's going to be statements, and so we have a as kind of Catherine alluded to, a kind of coroner's inquest where any death in hospital is reported to the coroner. Sometimes they're explained death. People die in hospitals by the nature of people are unwell. They come to hospital and stuff, and sometimes it's very clearly explained death and everything appropriate was done. But in cases where it's unexplained or it's very sudden and or there's delay or someone was sent home and comes back in and dies, the coroners will do, obviously there'll be an autopsy and the coroners will have an inquest. But that process could take a very long time. So Tim's inquest was 18 months or later. And during that time, then you're asked for statements and you're asked for your take on what had happened. And then you're aware that you're going to be going to the coroner's inquest and you're going to be facing the family who will be there. The coroner's inquest it's not supposed to be adversarial, let's say like a courtroom, but nevertheless it is in a court and people will bring along their legal representation. You will get cross-examined. So it is very much a fear for doctors, and it's very much defensive kind of first sort of thing. But it's not supposed to be adversarial. It's just supposed to be kind of fact-finding. Let's all together come to a judgment, maybe is the wrong word, or a decision as to what the cause was and what led to it here. But it can be a very stressful sort of thing. So because that took so long, again, I was busy. So in terms of my life, I kind of went on. I kind of forgot about it. I remember we were upset about it and we kind of discussed about it a good bit afterwards. But you kind of go on and busy exams, then I was moving jobs, I was getting a consultant job sort of thing. But eventually, you eventually get the email asking for your statement. Then you get an email saying there's a date set for the coroner's court. And then you kind of meet the team in advance of that and legal people, and it becomes very kind of stressful and kind of all-consuming. Yeah, sometimes when there's a coroner's inquest, it's okay that it's normal. Nothing bad has happened, and everything was done appropriately. And so not all coroner's inquests are like that. They can be fine, and they can be a good experience for everyone just to get clarity on what happened. But we knew that this would be a kind of stressful experience. So then when that can weigh heavily on you.
Facing that kind of loss through your job, that's obviously something that you'll have faced many times. I don't know what the numbers would be on that. How do you process that and work through that kind of loss when it's sort of, I don't want to say detached, but like you said, you don't know the history of all these people. You're dealing with things in the minute. So it's not like a personal grief where you know the whole story. You have to move on to the next shift. The next patient needs you quite quickly. So are you taught how to handle that, or is that something you've had to learn for yourself?
It's funny, in college you are taught breaking bad news. So you're taught how to break bad news to someone. And there is a way to, there are things not to say and there are things that you do have to say when you're breaking bad news to someone. So we are taught how to give that bad news in an empathetic and clear way. That is something even back when I was in college, and I'm qualified 20 years now, but that was something that was even done back then. I'd say there's more of an awareness of it now, but certainly when I qualified, no, there was no awareness. This is how you deal with something upsetting that happens or something unexpected. There was none of that. But people are more aware of it now. We do have debriefs, sometimes where you try to get together afterwards and discuss what happens, and anyone can talk about kind of how they're feeling. So, after a challenging case or a difficult case or a very interesting case, you may have a teaching session, a learning session about it afterwards. Okay, this is what the nature of this condition, this is what the investigations we should do, this is, the things to watch out for. But then you also have the debrief of the emotional debrief if anyone's upset by it or particularly stressed after a certain thing. That's something that we're often not as good at. Sometimes we call them hot debriefs initially. If you do it straight away after, if there's been a difficult resuscitation or a difficult event, we often do a hot debrief where you do it straight away afterwards. One of the reasons for that is because it's often never the same team on. When you're working in an emergency department, there's a number of different doctors, there's a number of different nurses, everyone's on a different shift rotation. So there's different teams, though you work together. I know all the nurses I work with, I know roughly all the doctors. So even though they rotate every 6 months and every 3 months, you get to know them fairly quickly. But there'll be a different combination of people on every shift. So if there's 6 or 7 you doctors and nurses who've been working on one patient, the 6 or 7 of you may not be on a shift together again, and then you're calling people in from home and they're not working to have a debrief. So often we try to do an immediate debrief, But then also that can have its weaknesses because people need time to process, particularly if something bad happened or if someone dies or there's an unexpected death. I mean, in terms of dealing with it as an emergency doctor, because often we see our patients for a very short period of time. But we do see death regularly, unfortunately. One of those common ways we see it is when someone has what we call an out of hospital cardiac arrest. So where they've collapsed out of hospital, they've had a heart attack or whatever, and the paramedics are great now. They're experts at resuscitating patients, and they'll bring the patients to us with ongoing resuscitation. We'll continue resuscitation, and often you can get patients back and get them to a cardiologist if that's what they need or whatever it is they need. But with an out of hospital cardiac arrest, actually the survival rate is fairly low, particularly if someone's had a downtime, if they haven't been discovered and someone hasn't started CPR straight away. So we'd regularly see out of hospital cardiac arrests, which oftentimes you don't get the patient back at all, and then you have a family come in who you're breaking the news to. I would say that's a routine part of our work, but it's something that you see very regularly. And you do also need to give that time, in terms of breaking the news to the family and kind of speaking with them. But from our personal point of view, because that's something we see regularly, it can be, what can be more difficult to deal with is when you have a patient who's in under you and you're seeing them, they're talking away to you and you're doing stuff with them and maybe ordering tests, or you're also seeing other patients and suddenly something happens. They take a turn or become worse and they have a cardiac arrest because you've already been involved in their care. You've spoke to them, you've developed some sort of rapport with them, and if something happens with them and they die, that can be a harder one to register, particularly I think for younger doctors. And then there'll always be the thing, oh, could I have done something differently? Could I have done something earlier? And then almost no matter what anyone says to you, you still question yourself on that, and it can very much knock people's confidence in their job.
So just tell us how you met Catherine then, because at the moment we've got obviously you involved in the case, but sort of somewhat distant, and you've got Catherine on the other side of it. So how did your paths actually cross?
Well, we didn't see each other until the coroner's inquest. That's kind of because you probably heard from me in terms of, my statement and stuff before I heard from you.
It was through the inquest that actually a lot more information was revealed. And there was only one person of all of the statements that were submitted through the process that mentioned aortic dissection, and that was very out of step with the hospital's original position. So the first kind of statement that we came across to say, actually, there was someone in the room that suspected this could have been one of those differential diagnoses. And that statement came from a man called John Cronin. So that was the first time I heard of John. His statement gave me a huge amount of hope that we had an opportunity to learn. The first time I met John and a number of the team from the hospital was at the inquest itself. And the outcome of the inquest was a ruling of medical misadventure. So the term negligence isn't a term that's accepted or recognised in an Irish coroner's court. And medical misadventure means that it's an unintended outcome from an intended action. So basically, no one intends harm. In essence, it was an accident. There were a number of recommendations that were made from that inquest, but I'd learned that those recommendations didn't need to be taken forward. And for me, that was a big catalyst to say, okay, where this was something that I'd put a lot of energy into, and was really disappointed to learn so late into that process that it wasn't going to be a driver for change. So I started to really try and work through what other opportunities, if that's the right word, how else can we make Dad's life and his death count for something and enact some change within this hospital and ideally further afield as well. So I started meeting with the leadership team of the hospital, but I also started, through invitation, attending medical conferences. So sharing my dad's story and my aunt's story, and just highlighting the issue around aortic dissection, because what happened in my family is actually a reflection of what happens in the UK and Ireland every year. 4,000 people have this condition, 2,000 people die, so half live, and a third of that is down to misdiagnosis. And so that was a real trigger to do something about it. And it was at one of these conferences in Galway I was looking at the poster section of the conference, and somebody had done a study on the number of diagnosed aortic dissections in Dublin. And the author of this research was a Dr. John Cronin. So my hairs just stood up on end. I was like very emotional. And I don't know how, but I had your email address at that point, John. And I remember emailing you saying, I'm at this conference, standing in front of this poster, got a few questions. Are you at this conference? Is this your work? And was this work inspired by what happened to my father? And John came back to say he wasn't at the conference, but it was his work. And it was inspired by what had happened to Dad that night. And I quickly got back to John to say, I'm actively campaigning, I'm actively wanting to work with hospitals, to work with the medical community, to try and drive change. And I'm really pleased that he is also doing the same, and that I would be open to doing something together. And at that point, I don't think we really knew what that something was. So we arranged to meet at an awareness conference in Liverpool. But it was quite a foggy flight in. And I think you had dropped off somewhere else in the UK and had a coach journey to make to Liverpool. So we didn't meet that year. And there was another conference the following year in London. And that's where John and I suppose, met in person outside of any kind of inquest or formal setting. My sister was with me too. And I think we probably spent most of the time crying. John, myself and my sister, it was hugely, hugely emotional. But we were really inspired by a lot of what we saw that day, and saw that there was an opportunity to take some good practice back to Dublin, and, made a commitment in the room that we were going to do something together. And then I think it was the following year, another meeting in Dublin. I think you were late to the dinner for all of the faculty speakers. There was only one seat left in the room, which was next to me. And, it was really nice to just connect in a very different setting, talk about our experiences and share what we might do together. But it was the following evening, I think I met your wife, and we were wearing the same dress, which was a bit of a moment for us both. She was so warm and so empathetic, and we both cried as well, actually, when we met. And she was, so sorry for what had happened, very sorry for your loss and for your family's loss. And we were talking a little bit, and she said something that really changed my whole outlook. And in fact, the charity that we formed, how that charity had put together, because she just asked if I had thought about the impact that it might have had on John and John's family. And I said, I have thought about it, but I hadn't given it a great deal of thought, because I completely accept and understand everyone goes into medicine to do good and not to do harm, but equally think lots is something you're exposed to, and that you might not always have control over when you're working in a medical setting too. And clearly sometimes mistakes are made, like in with Dad's case. But it was a real eye-opener. She shared from her perspective the stress, the strain, the grief, although it was a different type of grief. And for me, it opened my mind to how I wanted to work in this space in a completely different way. But yes, since then, John and I have gone on to do some great work together. In the COVID times, we held an education day completely dedicated to aortic dissection. We had a community of over 200 medical professionals from all over Ireland. We had faculty attend from America to share their knowledge and experience. And we've gone on to run face-to-face events together for the emergency medicine community and for surgeons themselves as well. And I suppose from all of those interactions that happened with the hospital directly after the inquest, they did go on to drive a lot of change. They conducted their own internal investigation, which led to 14 recommendations for change. One of those was around having a robust guideline for aortic dissection, its diagnosis, its detection, and how it's managed. And that went on to form a national guideline in Ireland, which I hadn't appreciated until John had invited some of the team to present at a conference that we had organised together. And they were sharing back the results of all of their work after the last 7 years, and the impact that Dad's experience had on the team there. It's an interesting relationship that we have in the sense of the work that we do together, because I think it surprises a lot of the medical community. I work with lots of medical professionals, but I have introduced John on a few occasions. As you know, John was part of my dad's team, and that's how we initially crossed paths. And I think people do find it surprising from on the medical side. And I think equally, family members who have lost a loved one equally find it very, very unusual how we have got ourselves into a space where I suppose we can, respect each other's loss and grief and come together and try and make something really, really positive from that. And not only try, we are succeeding and we are delivering some great work in the educational space together.
When you shared, I asked John about, what it was like listening. So when you then heard John talking through his side of things, that won't be the first time you've talked through about, but could you just sort of summarise what sort of impact has it had on you and your journey with bereavement, with grieving the loss of your father? How has your journey of grief been different, if it's been different, by having more of an understanding of what goes on behind the scenes of a hospital?
I mean, I think that's a really great question, Chris, and I think if you'd asked me across the timeline of the 8 years, it's really changed. So I think initially, in the very early days of losing Dad, I had a very low tolerance, I suppose, for kind of empathy. And I felt really angry about what happened. And although I didn't have all of the facts, I suspected that Dad could have had a very different outcome. And so it was very hard to connect on an empathetic level. For me, I think, I really wanted to, and I think for every individual and every family, and even within families, it's very, people have different views, whether they even want to step into a space of an inquest or whether they want to step in and have a meeting with the hospital to find out the facts. Because, sometimes I do reflect and think, it could have been easier maybe to think, well, this just was Dad's fate and it could have just been left. But I did want to continue to ask why and how and what. And so I really wanted more information. Sometimes that made the grief more difficult because you don't always like what you find and what you hear. I know very much that I'm keeping my grief alive through the work that I do, not only sharing my own personal experience, but I often meet, families, other bereaved families, or people who are living with their own loss through the condition, in that they're living a very different life. And equally, I have met medical professionals who've decided to step out because a life has been lost due to a misdiagnose or a missed aortic dissection. And for them, that has been the red line in their career and not one that they've wanted to step over. So I'm definitely an individual who wants to know the facts, who wants to understand why things have happened, and will think, even without information, how things could have been different. I'm definitely a scenario thinker. So it's the only way I could have walked my journey of grief, I think, is a hunger for understanding what happened, and a little along the way, understanding that we weren't alone. That was equally a trigger for me, understanding that so many other families go through loss to this particular condition. More people die of this condition in the UK and Ireland than people who die in road traffic accidents. It's a huge loss of life, and that was equally a decision to what can you use that energy for, because although there is a huge loss and sadness and pain that comes with grief, for me there has been a point in time to decide to use that energy, which is grief. There's nothing else that you can call it. It's huge pain, but use that energy to put it into something good. And sometimes I find that hugely helpful when I can see that it's improving and driving outcomes and opening doors for change or helping an individual family. And sometimes it just brings it all back, and it's really hard. But actually, I think it's something that my mum said to me. She said that if your dad had known what was to come following his death, I think he would have gladly laid down his life if he knew that it would save so many others or have the potential in the future to save so many others. And that's something, I don't know whether that's really how I feel. I don't know if that really is how he would have felt. He was a very giving man, but the fact is he has lost his life, and I really want his life and his death to count for something. So yeah, it changes, and I'm sure it will change again, Chris. It's you know, you meet so many different people along the way, and it's been hugely inspiring. I think the amount of people that want to step forward and support. It was interesting listening to John, particularly, you know, kind of describing whose name was on the board, who's accountable for the patient, the culture of the court, the coroner's court, where actually it is not supposed to be adversarial. And in Ireland, there is certainly negligence isn't, you know, linked to any individual or any hospital. But yet that setting creates a culture of, I believe, and I might have it wrong, John, but my perception, I think it does create a bit of fear. And I think that maybe that fear then creates a culture of blocking honesty and really being able to sit down and share with a family what really happened. And that's what, in my experience, I can't speak for all families, but for me, I just wanted to know. It was about information. It wasn't about blame. It was just about understanding. But I could feel the guards were up, and we should use failure as an opportunity for learning, even if that failure is the ultimate loss and it's death. It's so sad for that to be lost and turned into blame. That's not helpful for anybody, you know. And you can hear John describing the setting of a very busy department and all of the challenges. And I'm sure John would love the silver bullets in his working environment as much as I would love those silver bullets too. So I think it's uniting around change together.
Yeah, I could speak to that fear a little bit that comes with the coming up to the coroner's thing, because I mentioned after the case, because there's such a delay with it happening, sometimes it goes to the back of your mind. You know it's there somewhere, it's going to come up down the road. And then when it did come up and you had the date coming up, you start reflecting because you're fearful of this process that you're going into, and you fear the worst. You know, you kind of fear, oh, if this family are going to try and get me, or either get you to sue you, or I'm going to be in the paper, or someone's going to report you to the medical council or try to take your license. And you start this disaster thinking because of this terrible event that's happened. And I guess maybe one phase of it is kind of anger, or maybe that's kind of a phase of grief as well. Yeah, I started thinking, well, why it's unfair that I had to work in this system that was overstressed. It was unfair that I had to work, why did I have to work in a department that was crowded and hampered the way I can do my job and the way the department works, you know, and you know, why wasn't it easier for us to get scans, or why didn't a different specialist come, or why didn't I have a better colleague on, and you start looking outwards and getting defensive and a little bit angry. And it was actually, I remember when we went in to meet the kind of legal medicine person who was representing the hospital, and I remember him saying, he was like, you know, because people maybe were talking a little bit defensively, and he said, look, if there's something you feel you could have done differently, or something you feel that wasn't right, just say it and own it. I remember saying this, just to own it. Because I think it becomes clear to everybody, and you know yourself internally, if you're trying to cover something up or saying, well, I did everything right, and it was the system's problem, or was that other department's problem, you know, he said, oh, if you feel you could have done something differently, I could have done things differently. There are different things I could have done. It was important just to own that, you know, when you know it's true. But as Catherine says, yeah, the maybe the way medicine is, we are a little bit defensive, and we don't always own up to those things, which then maybe doesn't allow for the learning or the improvements or the changes to happen, both for yourself as an individual and for departments and for specialties. And, you know, I think positive change has happened. I mean, Catherine mentions about the work we've done together. I should say Catherine's done most of the work. And it's only happened because of her passion and her drive, which is quite remarkable. And it's certainly changed the way I approach patients who possibly have aortic dissection. But I would say that it's changed the approach of every department in Ireland and probably across the UK. The awareness that she's brought to the condition as a result of her father's passing, you'll struggle to meet any doctor in an emergency department or in the relevant specialties who wouldn't be aware of it and who hasn't been impacted by it, because whether they know it or not, they have been.
It's interesting because one of the questions we ask all our guests is, do you ever ask the question why? But you've kind of covered that because you have asked the questions. Catherine's been searching for answers through her roots and through the medical system, and why did this happen? And you just listed a whole load of why questions there you ask. So it's interesting how you've both had to wrestle with that question and sort of found ways to sort of live with it or get those answers. John, do you feel like that's something that comes up a lot in your job? Is the why question something that you have to sort of make peace with sometimes because you don't get the answers that you want?
Yeah, you do feel like sometimes you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. There is a real randomness. I suppose there's a randomness to life in the same way you can just randomly meet someone that you mightn't have met otherwise. You go through, that sliding doors, and I know sliding doors has been a theme of the way Catherine's done some of her talks. These are kind of sliding doors moments. Your father may not have been in Dublin that day. He may have gone to a different department. He may have met a different doctor. I could come on my shift at the same time as another doctor, and we both go up to pick a patient, and he just happens to pick the first one and I pick the second one, or vice versa. And that patient could get a totally different experience. Much as we like things to be systematized and guidelines and protocols, that person could have a totally different experience with that doctor versus me, and vice versa. So there's real randomness to working in an emergency department. And people call emergency departments A&Es, accident emergencies, but that also stands for anything and everything. And the next person you could see could be the most nondescript, stubbed their toe, easy thing, or it could be the case that you'll remember when you retire more than any other. And you just get to accept that there's a randomness and anything can happen. Because initially you can be angry, well, why did I have to pick up that patient, or why was I there, or why did that happen on my shift? So you just need to kind of make peace with that.
Let's end with our final question, John. While you're warmed up through all of this, what's your Herman?
I think my Herman, the game changer on this, has been working and engaging with family members and loved ones of patients and involving patients. Because as medics, we tend to meet as medics, and we have our meetings and our education meetings just with medics and just with doctors there, and sometimes just with only doctors of your own specialty, and we meet in silos. Aortic dissection doesn't respect those silos. Big change for me has been not having a fear of working with patients, families and loved ones, particularly if things haven't gone to plan. There is a defensive culture in medicine where sometimes we worry about what people will think of us, or mistakes we've made, or lack of knowledge or understanding that we might have. But there is just no way that we would have made the progress on aortic dissection had it been just us as a bunch of emergency physicians or as a bunch of doctors compared to what Catherine has done. So in any large project that I'm involved in now, whether it's research or whatever it is, we look at ways in which we can involve patients or relatives who may be involved or affected by that area. And most funding bodies who fund research want patient involvement at some level. So this experience and Tim's loss, that's the change it's made to me.
Catherine, as John said, it was your dad that you lost. So much good has come out of that. But through the years of grieving, of working, what's your Herman?
Maybe one of the hardest questions to answer this year. There's been so many Hermans, and I hope that there's going to be many more. But for me, really, my Herman is heightened awareness that you can get a handle on your grief. You can turn it into something quite powerful if you're willing to take yourself there and keep your grief alive. And it's been and will continue to be, I think, a journey of grief, but harnessing it as a passion for change and being able to amplify the voice for others, and equally in harnessing a community, being able to find empathy for others' grief along the way. And that was a little unexpected at the beginning of my journey. I couldn't see myself having the levels of empathy that I've had with members from the medical community, and I think that's quite a powerful thing. And yeah, for me, I think it's an ability to harness grief and use it for something positive for yourself and equally to help others.
a lovely couple of Hermans. Both speak into the power of involving others to create something special that then helps others in their grief. Their work reminds me of the Jana Stanfield quote, "I cannot do all the good the world needs, but the world needs all the good that I can do." And often that involves a level of sacrifice when you have to keep facing your own pain in the process. So thank you to everyone that has taken their grief and turned it into something to help others.
A huge thank you to Catherine and John for chatting with us. And to find out more about the Aortic Dissection Charity or to contact them, visit their website, aorticdissectioncharitabletrust.org, or you can find them on social media, and we'll put all the links in the show notes.
We also did another episode early on in the podcast which originally connected us to Catherine and John with author and psychotherapist Sasha Bates, who lost her husband very suddenly through aortic dissection. And she shares her experience in Lost 23, and again, I'll put a link in the show notes.
Now, for more about us, visit thesilentwhy.com or on social media at thesilentwhypod. You can also now visit thehermancompany.com. That's where you can buy or see Claire's newly launched Hermans, which are the perfect gift to send someone who's going through a rough time when you're struggling to know what to say.
And if you'd like to support my work on the podcast and now producing Hermans, there's a link in the bio where you can either buy me a fancy tea at buymeacoffee.com/thesilentwhy, because I'm more of a tea drinker, or support the podcast monthly, or send a Herman to someone you know, or even buy one for yourself. You can also sign up to my mailing list, which I use when I have exciting news to share, and all these links are in the show notes.
We're finishing this episode with a quote from Thomas S. Monson, which speaks into what we believe Catherine and John and all the others involved with the charity are doing with their important work.
Along your pathway of life, you will observe that you are not the only traveller. There are others who need your help. There are feet to steady, hands to grasp, minds to encourage, hearts to inspire, and souls to save. Or, in the case of the Aortic Dissection Charitable Trust, you could almost say souls to inspire and hearts to save.